My name is Laura, and on behalf of the Academy of Therapy Wisdom, I want to thank you for being here today. We're so happy to have this opportunity to learn in community with you. I just want to mention we did a previous course with Ruth called The Hidden Trauma of Neglect. And sometimes we create a course and we never know how folks are going to respond, but the response to that course has been so positive, with lots of folks reaching out about it, including 200 mental health professionals from the Ukraine that took the course a couple of months ago. Are any of you here today? I hope so. So, with that enthusiasm for the topic, we asked Ruth to begin a series on neglect. Today's call will be 90 minutes. We'll bring Ruth on stage in just a moment, but letting you know that the format of today is that Ruth will give her presentation, after which I want to tell you about what's next in her neglect series for just a couple of moments, and then we will have time for Q&A. And now on to our intro. Ruth is a seasoned psychotherapist based in the Bay Area who's been working with survivors of developmental trauma, particularly the often overlooked impact of childhood neglect. She's a certified sex therapist, EMDR and sensory motor psychotherapy practitioner, and author of 3 deeply insightful books, including Coming Home to Passion, Restoring Loving Sexuality in Couples with Histories of Childhood Trauma and Neglect. In her work, Ruth reframes the common clinical puzzle where clients say nothing happened, and yet they struggle with intimacy, regulation, and sexual connection. Because Ruth knows that neglect is the trauma that leaves no bruises, yet deeply shapes our capacity to feel, relate, and to love. Through her groundbreaking apologies, through her groundbreaking neglect-informed sex therapy training, she equips therapists to speak about sex with compassion and clarity, untangling shame, silence, and relational stuckness from a no-blame framework. So please join me in welcoming Ruth Cohn.
Thank you, Laura, for the lovely introduction. And I have to tell you, as a longtime child of neglect who's been working on my trauma and who's been teaching about neglect for many years, when I saw all those names and places of people that are here, it's still a shock to a part of me that anybody's there, that anybody's going to look at me or listen to me or, want to hear what I have to say. So thank you for identifying yourself. And similarly, if you do ask a question, I hope you'll turn on your camera so I can really see you, because I love seeing and sort of proving to that part of me that still sometimes rears up that, you know what, somebody's looking, somebody's listening, because for that part, it's hard to believe, even after all these years. All that being said, I have so much to say today, and I'll be honest with you, I've been very interested in sexuality and sex since I was a little girl. And one who has early sexual trauma often has a supercharged sexual system in their own body and in their own mind, because you're stimulated. If you have early trauma, early sexual trauma, you have an early sort of overstimulation of the body. It's more charge than that little body is designed to hold developmentally at that point. So very often, as is true for many of us, we have an sort of an over intensely acute sexual body experience, as well as often a lot of mind preoccupation with sex. I know I did ever since I was a little girl. And when I started my sex therapy training in 2000, one of the very seasoned sex therapists said in a conference, the reason why we become sex therapists is because we think about sex 24 hours a day. Well, some of us do, and there's no shame in that. Anyway, so that's a little bit of background about me. I am an old married lady, and what I was going to say is, in my youth, and I come from the free love generation and the women's liberation movement, and the years right after we got contraception, which is, now very much in jeopardy, certainly in this country. But we had some little sort of slang words that I don't even know if they're still used, but we used the word quickie or the word nooner to mean what when we would squeeze in a quick little lovemaking session when we didn't really have the time to spend elaborating and enjoying ourselves sexually. So think of this webinar today as not quite a nooner because it's too early for that here, but a quickie because I have so much to say to you about sex and we only have so much time today. I do hope that you will have questions. We have a nice Q&A to look forward to, and I want to shout out to our tech and support angels, Laura and Bridget. And once again, I like to call attention to the invisible people who make the world go round, which are tech support people. Often they never hear anything except for when people have problems. So I really want to acknowledge that without support people that are often invisible, like Laura and Bridget, the world would not go round and I would not be able to do much. So, all that being said, I will begin the talk. Why neglect matters. And one of the great things that came out of Boston conference, the Boston Trauma Conference, which I recently came back from, is an attachment researcher, a very famous one, who I have been following for many, many, many years. She presented data about neglect. And I'll have to tell you that I've been studying neglect very seriously since 1998. I've been a sex therapist since 2000. And for all those over 25 years, I've been trying to bring sexuality and neglect to the trauma field. The trauma field has been very interested in incident trauma. The trauma field has been very interested in sexual trauma, but as far as any other kind of sexuality and any other kind of trauma, I really didn't get very far there. So finally, after all these years, the trauma field, which I'm very devoted to, is getting interested in both sexuality, healthy sexuality, loving sexuality, pleasurable, fun sexuality, and also neglect trauma, which is invisible and has been barely known about. So, we're going to have a brief review of some of the main issues in neglect that bear on the sexual relationship. And of course, I can't go into it very much today because I don't have the time, but I hope you'll join us for the course where I'm going to have more time to talk about neglect and sexuality and some of the sexual problems specifically that we see with neglect trauma. But I want to start with what is the most, what I was going to say about the trauma conference is this attachment researcher, Carlin Lyons Ruth, really identified what I have been sort of teaching and anecdotally knew from my many years of working with it that attachment trauma and neglect trauma are truly the most severely injurious, damaging kinds of trauma that there are. And because they're invisible and because they're not very well known about, people don't know why they have this feeling that nothing matters, or they don't know what's wrong, or they feel shame about not feeling good because they look like they've got it all, but they feel bad. And the nature of attachment, and we all know this, the nature of attachment is when we don't feel connected, when we don't have love, when we don't have attachment. Not only do we feel a kind of loneliness, but we feel this profound kind of ennui, like nothing matters. And so the child of neglect is likely to feel, and this is a signature, they feel like nothing happened to me, so I have no reason to feel bad, but I feel bad. So they feel shame about feeling bad and confused about feeling bad. And they bring that with them into the world and they feel like nothing matters. And that is a miserable place to live. So, Carlin Lyons Ruth, this longtime attachment researcher, actually identified the data that really proves this point that this is the deepest, most profound trauma that there is. So, it's really worth our beginning to learn about it and beginning to learn about all the ways that it shows up. So, that being said, I'm only going to talk about one aspect of neglect trauma today, which is, and this comes from Mary Main. Mary Main was an attachment researcher. She was a local treasure for me. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, USA, and she was at UC Berkeley. Sadly, she died in 2024. I never saw her in person, but she left this really important mark on attachment literature. And she came up with what she calls the dilemma without solution, which I will lay out to you. She also named the fourth attachment style, which is the disoriented, disorganized attachment style. And what we learned from Carlin Lyons Ruth this year is that the mother that has a disoriented, disorganized attachment style is much more likely to neglect her children. So we have the intergenerational transmission of neglect, which is insidious. So here's how the dilemma works. Attachment is a survival need. For the infant, I used to say attachment, survival, or the attachment to the mother and or the primary caregiver, but I use the shorthand for a mother because it's tedious to say primary caregiver, and it's most often the mother. But the attachment to the mother is a survival need. Not only is the mother metaphorically like, but the mother is the source of food, the source of warmth, the source of comfort, the source of soothing, the source of protection from predators. We share this with all our mammal brothers and sisters and cousins. So, in the case of the mother being withdrawn or lost or absent or somehow or rejecting or indifferent or unreliable, more than anything, simply absent, the infant experiences that loss, that absence as life threatening. The experience of that child is, I'm gonna die. And you know what? That's true. Without that attachment, they will die. So their entire experience in this little infant organism, and once again, we share this with all the other mammal cousins and relatives that we have, is we will die without that attachment. So it's terrifying. And because the infant doesn't yet have the equipment to learn cognitively, it doesn't yet have the equipment for narrative, for language, for story, for autobiographical memory. How does this memory, this experience get logged? Well, it gets logged in emotion, it gets logged in sensory, somatic, and imaginal experience, but there's no story. So the experience is nothing. There's nothing to remember except these fragments of experience floating around unintegrated in the brain and nervous system of the body. Now, in incident trauma and what we know about from trauma, work that we've all done for many years, is that when we are activated by incident trauma, when we're being attacked by a predator, it is adaptive to fight or flee or freeze because we're enhancing our possibility of saving our life. But if we are to fight or flee when our life is at risk, we're not going to enhance our survival by being away from that source of survival. We're going to lose the source of survival. So we need to find a way to stay connected so we don't die. So what does that infant do? Well, that infant will reach or call out, and that's what they tend to do. That's what we tend to do in this situation. We reach for that longed for beloved other, and yet at the same time we're in terror. So we pull away, reach for, pull away, reach for, pull away. That's the dilemma. And it's unresolvable. So finally, exhausted, the infant will collapse and they lose their voice and they lose their spine and they become very understimulated. I'll have more to say about this in the course. But meanwhile, we have a new template for relationship, which is this juxtaposition of longing and terror. We want to be connected. We desperately need to be connected because that is nature's design. And at the same time, it feels life-threatening. So this becomes the pattern. This becomes the enduring relationship template that repeats itself over and over again in our relationships through the lifespan until we do the work of neglect-informed psychotherapy, which is another whole subject. So, if this is our relationship template, what does that mean for the sexual relationship? And how on earth can we help people who fear if they're going to be connected, they're going to, run the risk of subsequent, you know, loss and then death? So how do we help people resolve this dilemma? That is the conundrum of sexuality. Now, add to that, and this is a real strong feeling that I have, that I talk about a lot, and I really want you to get this, which is why I'm so glad you're here listening to me. In our world, certainly in my country, there is this deafening silence about sexuality. We are surrounded by titillation, by ways that we get somehow or other turned on by imagery, by innuendo, by advertising, by the internet, by things that we hear or things that are alluded to, or when we watch, certainly in this country, one of the biggest sporting events in the year, which is the Super Bowl, it's peppered with all these ads for erection enhancing drugs. So there's all this surrounding sort of titillation about sex, and yet nobody's really giving good information. And this is something I feel so strongly about, that doctors don't prepare their patients for the sexual implications of an illness or a medication or a procedure. Psychiatrists say, oh, I've got the antidepressant for you. It's going to knock out your depression. And oh, by the way, they don't tell you that it's going to kill your libido, that it's going to destroy your orgasm. So you trade your depression for your sex life. Is that a deal you would have made knowingly? No, but you didn't know. And it's not their orgasm, it's not their libido, it's not their sex life. They don't tell you. So, doctors, oncologists, psychiatrists, even therapists, even people like us. I have people who come into couples therapy all the time who tell me we've been in three, four, five, couples therapies before. No one ever asked us about our sexual relationship. No one ever inquired. So, why do we need to talk about sex? Because we need to break the silence. How do people interpret this silence? Well, and the child of neglect categorically had no one to ask, nowhere to turn, nowhere to go for answers. So they were always thrown on their own devices. And so by no one talking to them, including us, they feel like it's not okay to not know. They're supposed to know, or it's natural. Everybody knows, so why don't I know? They feel shame about knowing. Maybe they come from a family where it's bad to talk about it, or there's morality, or they got messages in their families about you don't talk about this out loud. And there was no one to ask, no one to tell. I know for myself, no one talked to me. And when my menstrual period started at 9 years old, I was scared. I thought I was bleeding to death because I didn't know anything. Finally, after hiding my dirty underwear in the garbage too many times, I asked my sister and she helped me. Thankfully, I had someone to ask, but many people have no one to ask, and they don't know it's okay to not know. They don't know it's okay to talk about it with us. So, by our breaking the silence, we're giving people the message it's okay to not know. It's okay to ask. It's okay to talk with your partner about sex. You cannot imagine how many couples have never talked about sex with their partner and they don't know because they've never asked or they've never told what their partner likes, what their partner doesn't like. So we need to make it okay to speak out loud, which means we need to practice talking out loud about sex, meaning say the words explicitly, say penis, say vagina, say masturbate, say all the words, not down there, not that thing, not, do the dirty or whatever it is, some kind of euphemism. No, we want to be very candid, very explicit. So this will take practice for many of us because many of us have never spoken out loud about it either. So it's a learning curve all the way around, which is why you're here. Now, another important question is what's normal? And sidebar, the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists is the certifying body of sex therapists in the US. And they have a hotline. And the hotline is where you can call in and anonymously ask your questions about sex. And about 90 to 98% of the questions that come in on the hotline are some variation of, is it normal? Is it normal that I want to blah, blah, blah? Is it normal that my partner is blah, blah, blah? Is it normal? People don't know what is normal, as if there were a normal. Well, you know what? There is a world, a universe of possibilities. And you cannot imagine some of the things that some people do and that some people want to do, and some people fantasize about, and some people imagine. And this book, and I'm not necessarily recommending it, but it's quite a read. It's got 40,000 sexual fantasies. And this author, he polled individuals all over the world. He's got 40,000 sexual fantasies in there, and I've read them all, and some of them were just sort of made my head spin. but you cannot imagine what people imagine. And similarly, people have a lot of shame and confusion about what's going on in their head. And so they will want to know from us. So we need to know that, first of all, there is no normal. There is no norm. There is a world of possibilities. So, where do we begin? Well, that's where you get the 6 principles of sexual health. And I learned about these from Doug Braun Harvey, who has since retired. And that's too bad, but you can still find him. You can still find his book, and he trains a lot of people. And so you can find his information. But I learned these from him, and this is very helpful in terms of people asking you what's normal or what's okay. So these are the 6 non-negotiable principles. First, and I hope you'll forgive me, I do not mean in any way to be sacrilegious by using the symbol of the Ten Commandments. To me, these 6 principles are that important, that much like rules to live by for our sexual relationship. First and foremost, and I think we're all familiar, especially if we have sexual trauma in our history or in our training, consent. It has to be consensual to be healthy and to be safe and to be comfortable and God forbid to be pleasurable. So consent, and it needs to be explicit consent. It's not a drunken consent or a implied consent, but very explicit yes or no. So consent is probably the most important one. Non-exploitation is very related to consent. We don't want any power imbalance unless, of course, it's consensual. Some people like power discrepancies, and by agreement, it's fine. But if it's not by agreement and one partner has more power than the other and is taking advantage or using, or one way or the other, gratifying themselves at the expense of the other, that is exploitation. Honesty. And by honesty, we don't only mean honesty about fidelity versus infidelity, if that's something that this couple has agreed to, but it's also honesty about things like faking your orgasm or pretending you like something that you don't. We want to be transparent. We want to be authentic. We want to really feel safe enough to express ourselves fully to our partner. This is an element of health. We want to have shared values, certainly shared values about sexuality. John Gottman, the marriage researcher, talks about what he calls the oh God, what did he call it? The marital house, the shared marital house. I can't remember. Anyway, something like that, where it's basically shared values, a shared value system. And if one partner thinks that polyamory is a really, valuable way to go, and the other person does not, that's not a shared value. That needs to be worked out. And similarly, how we feel about things like shaving or things like appearance or things like body size or shape, many things that are important to one, and we need to verify that it's a shared value so that nobody feels judged, so that nobody's operating outside of their zone of what feels, morality or what they believe in. So this needs to be agreed on. We need protection from sexually transmitted infections and diseases. Very important, especially for those of us who came up in the years where the AIDS epidemic was really terrible, as I did. And in my generation, all of us lost many friends and many people due to AIDS. Now it's much better in San Francisco, certainly, but in many places of the world, it is still a danger, as are other sexually transmitted infections. So we want to make sure that we're safe from that. I add to this one safety from unwanted pregnancy for a number of reasons, because I have seen in my experience and in my practice too many cases where one partner perhaps does want to conceive and the other doesn't, and there's not full transparency about whether contraception is still actively being used and by agreement. And, having a child by agreement is a wonderful thing, but if the child is unwanted, even by one parent, that makes for more neglect trauma and another sort of transmission of this intergenerational insidious trauma of neglect. We don't want that. And finally, last but not least, mutual pleasure. And mutual is not part of Doug's paradigm, but I want to add mutual because it's important that both partners have pleasure. And I was surprised to find when I heard an interview with a Kenyan woman who teaches sexual health all over the world that there are places in the world where women don't even know that there's a category of sexual pleasure for women because they learned from the beginning that sex is an obligation that we owe to our male partner and that our job is to procreate and our job is to be available, and they don't even know that there's a category of female pleasure. So mutual pleasure is very important. So I want to add my golden rule, and this goes back to my own history, and I'm not a religious Jew. You won't hear me talk about the Talmud very often or quote it very often. And I always say that the fact that I'm Jewish does not in any way communicate anything about where I'm at, about what's going on in the world. I have, my heart is broken about what's going on in the world. So, all that being said, my golden rule goes back to when I was in first grade, second grade, and I was in Hebrew school. And we always heard this story about Rabbi Hillel. And Rabbi Hillel was a Talmudic scholar. And one time, one of his students or disciples said, "So, Rabbi Hillel, tell us the essence of Talmud with while standing on one foot." And you won't hear me quote the Talmud very often because I don't know much and I rarely do. But Rabbi Hillel, he got up on one foot and he answered the question as follows. And we learned it in Hebrew and we learned it a little song about it. And what he said was the following. He said, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what good am I? If not now, when?" He said. That is the essence of Talmud. Now go and study. So fast forward to the year 2000. I learned this when I was in first grade, second grade. It stuck in my brain, my hippocampus. So fast forward 2000, I've just begun my sex therapy training. And, by some aberration, I found myself going to a religious service, which I don't often do. And lo and behold, part of the sermon was this old story about Rabbi Hillel. And I listened to this story and I thought, wow, Rabbi Hillel was the first sex therapist. And I thought, if I'm only with my own experience, my own sensation, my own emotion, my own feeling about where I'm at in the relationship, if I'm only with myself in the sexual interaction, what kind of a lover am I going to be? I'm not going to be much of a lover. I'm too self-absorbed. And if I'm completely focused on the other, where I'm only focused on the other person's experience and what they're feeling and what they want and how they're responding and their emotion and their sensation and where they're at in relation to me, I'm not there. I'm not going to be much of a lover. And if I'm not in the moment, if I'm not present in the moment, it's not going to work. So, what Rabbi Hillel said, be with myself, be with the other, be in the moment, is the essence of good sex. All the rest is practice. So I use the shorthand of the word mindfulness because the way I learned mindfulness, and I'm not a mindfulness person, but when I studied sensory motor psychotherapy in the early 2000s, the way we defined mindfulness then was where a person has sort of a dual attention, where you're in your experience and you're able to be on the outside of your experience, observing your experience. Basically, being with myself and also aware of myself. So, in it and aware of it, and being attuned to the other is an empathic stance, and being present in the moment, presence. And Peggy Kleinplatz, who I mentioned earlier, I haven't mentioned her yet. She is, I think of her as the best sex therapist in the world. She did research. She did hands-on data collection with over 20,000 long-term monogamous self-identified happy couples. And she asked them, what are the elements of good sex? And categorically, the vast majority of people, almost all of them, at the top of their list identified presence as being the key element in what made sex, to use her word, magnificent. So, presence is optimal, as are all these other aspects. So, this is my add on golden rule. So, back in graduate school, and I was in graduate school a very long time ago in the 1980s, and I don't know if this is still true, but I suspect that it is. And that is what we learned about the sexual arousal curve was the following. It was sort of a shape like this curve, and it starts with desire, and we go arousal, orgasm, resolution, or no, yeah, resolution, and then settling down. And so we thought everybody normal walks around in a state of desire. Now, some of us do, or some of us do at some times in our lives. And those of you who have adolescent, kids might find that your house is sort of exploding with hormones and horniness. And that is, to be expected at certain developmental stages. But if we expect that we're walking around in a desirous state all the time, as some people are, and we aren't, it's easy to fall into the trap of feeling pathological, like, oh my God, I'm not normal. I have female sexual desire disorder or some kind of sexual desire disorder or discrepancy of desire is not normal. Well, what Rosemary Basson added to the literature in the year 2000 is about 60% of males, and I don't know if this now has been updated to include non-binary people, but back in 2000, it was done with male versus female subjects. About 60% of males and 40, no, 60% of females and 40% of males did not walk around in a state of desire, but rather needed some kind of additional stimulation to get to desire. And there's nothing abnormal about this, and there's nothing wrong with it. We simply add in some vehicle of desire, whether it be erotica or visual or some kind of head start in the arousal process where there's more stimulation added, or some kind of erotic stimulation that brings that person to desire that matches the other partner so they can have a satisfying experience, which is imminently doable. So there's nothing wrong with you if you want to have sex all the time, or you don't walk around wanting it all the time or even ever. You can get there. And I can remember one of my great teachers, one of my first sex therapy teachers, Pat Love, who wrote the book in the early 80s called Hot Monogamy, one of the first couples therapy books that really talked about sex. And Pat used to say about herself, my libido is so low it could crawl under a snake. And that's how she felt about herself. And she had a lot of shame about it. There's no shame in low libido, and it's not going to destroy your sex life with your partner. So, all that being said, let's update our files. It's not what you learned in graduate school. So, moving right along, what is necessary for us to be a sex, to work with sexuality, with neglect survivors or with anyone? Very important. You don't have to have a perfect, whatever that is, sex life to do this work. Most of us don't. And I remember when I first started my sex therapy training and I would be in these workshops or conferences and I'd look around the room and I'd see all the other people and I would feel so much shame because, I have sexual problems and I didn't think anybody else did. And not true. Whatever a perfect sex life is, none of us have it, very few. So we don't have to have a great or even have a sex life to be able to do this work. But there's some things that we do need to have, and those are the following. We do need to have humility about things that we don't know. We want to be curious, not intrusive, but curious and encouraging. We want to be easy, comfortable, talking about it ourselves. This requires practice. So we need to practice with our supervisors, with our peers, with our consultants, with our consultees, with our partners. We have to practice saying the words, talking about sex, especially if it's not normal. I mean, not familiar. We didn't grow up in families where it was okay, so we don't know how. We don't know how to do it with ease. Candor. We want to have ease and be able to, be very relaxed about it and be relaxed about hearing it and relaxed about talking about it. So we want to be inviting. We need to continuously learn. We need patience because many of our clients have been working with these issues for a very long time. So they want it to be over with and they have a hard time believing that it will ever end. And as with all trauma work and certainly with neglect work, it's slow going. So we have to be patient and try and inspire patience in them. And if you can bring in humor, if you can make it fun, that much better. Sex has the possibility of being a really good time. You must do your own work. We must do our own work. And this is particularly necessary in working with neglect, because in terms of neglect, so much of the memory is nonverbal. So much of what's communicated is communicated non-verbally. We have to be very aware of our own material, making sure that my unspoken material doesn't contaminate what the client brings. So be mindful of your own material, do your own work. It is the work of a lifetime. And believe me, I'm an old lady, I'm an old married lady. We have to keep doing this work our whole lives. So, about educating yourself. These are some of my favorite books. You will find some of yours. This is Doug's book, Treating Out Control Sexual Behavior. I'm not going to talk about the myth of sex addiction right now, but we will address it in the course. So the six principles are in here, and you can also you can download the PowerPoint that will, or it'll come to you as part of your registration. So you'll remember the six principles. I want you to really memorize them. This next book is an important one because it talks about sex and love in midlife. And the body changes, relationships change, many things change in long-term monogamous couples. So this is a book about how to keep up with the change. This other one, Guide to Getting It On, is a favorite one of mine. You'll find your own favorites. This is an old book. It's been revised many times. I'm sure that the revision that I have is probably not up to date about some of the more recent developments in the world about non-binary sexualities and trans, which was much less known about 25 years ago. This next one is a book about how to talk to your children about sex, and there are many different good books out there, many for different age groups. So find the ones that you feel good about so that your children don't grow up with this mandate to not talk. Magnificent Sex is Peggy's book about, what are the elements of good sex, and it's worth reading. And then this one here is my first book, 2010. It has stood the test of time, although there are many ways that it has been, updated in the 25 years since I wrote it. So my other golden rule is the following, and I'm almost done here. I know you have your questions, and I want to hear them. This is my other golden rule. And I always say all my success of any kind is based on this. Find the best consultation money can buy. Tell them everything. And I mean everything, including your mistakes, the things you're afraid to tell about yourself or about your work. Tell them everything and do what you're told. And if you do that, you'll probably be okay. So remember, we are harbingers of hope. And one of the categorical elements that you find so readily in survivors of neglect is hopelessness. Nothing ever changed for them, so they can't believe that things will change. So we have to carry that. And often it's hard for us, especially if we feel like we're not effective enough. We have to know that it's slow going and it will get better, especially if you really stick with your therapist's imperatives and do what's necessary to really learn. So perhaps you'll join us for the course coming up the next two Fridays. And that being said, we will go on to the Q&A, which Bridget and Laura are going to handle for us. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I hope that if you are with us, that you will turn on your camera when you ask your question. If you're not putting the question in the chat, I'm not sure how it's going to work. But I'm going to stop my share and turn it over to you. So thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you very much for telling me that you're there, because it's hard for me to believe that there's somebody there, but you know what? I know you are. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to you. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you next week.
Well, thank you so much, Ruth, because that was incredibly insightful. And I think that everybody got a lot of value out of that today.
Oh, I hope so.
I want to take just a moment to spotlight something truly special we have coming up later this month, which is Ruth's 2-day Neglect Informed Sex Therapy Workshop, which, as Ruth said, is running June 20th and 27th. This isn't just another training, it's a vital piece of the puzzle that has been Ruth's life's work. 4 decades of deep clinical engagement with trauma, attachment, and especially the hidden wounds of neglect. Since 1988, she's witnessed how what didn't happen in childhood, the absence of mirroring, safety, responsive presence, shows up as confusion, shame, silence, and sexual disconnection in clients, even when they say, "Nothing happened to me." So, this workshop is Ruth's mission in motion. She's thought through every element from the clinical foundation to the nuts and bolts of what to say, how to say it, and how to stay embodied while doing it. Every slide, every teaching, every principle reflects her deep commitment not only to growing therapist skill sets, but to shifting an entire field towards seeing neglect as a central driver in sexual health and intimacy. By participating in the live training, you're not only gaining a clinically grounded, no blame model for addressing sexual development wounds, you're directly supporting Ruth's mission to bring invisible trauma into the light and to give therapists the tools they've been missing and to dismantle the silence that keeps clients stuck. So I encourage you, don't miss this opportunity. Join Ruth's mission driven work, build your clinical toolkit, and be part of transforming how we understand and treat the long shadow of neglect. So now we're going to drop the link to the workshop in the chat where you can learn more and claim your spot to be there for us. And so you can learn more if you just click the link, ask questions if you have any, we're happy to help. And from there, we're going to turn to some questions that have been coming in. So, Ruth,
Yes.
we had someone give us a bit of a scenario they would like your input on. I'm going to read that out to you.
Okay, take it slow because I want to make sure that I get it.
Fair enough. A toddler, aged 32 months, is experiencing the trauma of neglect, both emotionally and physically, from his mother. He is more attached to his maternal grandmother than to his mom. He's spending more time with his dad and paternal grandmother for the past 2 months now, and the mother has become substance abusive with all of the behaviors that are associated with that. What can the three caregivers in his life do to help him heal from the neglect and the detachment from his mother?
Wow, that is a great question. And how old did you say this child is?
32 months.
32 months, so that's almost three. Okay, so a lot of harm has already been done by that time. And a lot of this, so much of this trauma, it's a boy? It's a boy?
Yes, it is.
Okay, it's a male infant. Okay, well, first of all, and this is hard to swallow, it's hard to accept, but the damage is so early, is so primary, because the early moments and months of development is when the brain is really developing. So these patterns really go into the system very early. So that's unfortunate. However, like with our work in therapy, where we work with adults, what we're really most importantly focusing on is the connection. So, to really learn the infant's language of distress, what they need when they get that attachment presence, when they really have somebody listening, somebody there, somebody who picks them up and holds them, somebody who talks to them, somebody who's really there. That is how we begin to repair this. Now, what we're also learning so much in the in the trauma field is how much of the healing is somatic. One of the tragic things about neglect trauma and early neglect trauma is, and this comes out of the attachment research, because the attachment style that most often is associated with neglect is the one that's hideously named the avoidant dismissive attachment style. And I don't like the word avoidant because it sounds intentional and it sounds kind of blaming, and I'm so committed to no blame. But the research about the avoidant attachment is that very often the mother is repelled by the infant's body. She doesn't want to touch her child, which is heartbreaking. Imagine the experience of the infant that even wordlessly, and it's all wordless, I'm untouchable. I'm cold. I'm scared. I want to be held, but I'm, rejected. So bringing the touch in is really important. So one of the ways to work with that young child is with touch, with song, with nonverbal ways of really being present. Now, one thing I'm learning a lot about, and I'm very actively preparing for a talk that I'm going to give at the Oxford conference in September, has to do with gender differences between the sort of, if we go binary, the male developing brain and the female developing brain. And categorically, and I didn't know this until recently, this comes out of the research of Alan Shore, who's an attachment research giant, that the male child needs more regulation, needs more help to settle down, that female babies are born smiling more and more receptive to attachment cues from the mother, and the male infant is born grimacing more and crying more and, being more irritable. So they're harder to take care of. And if you have a traumatized mother who is easily, dissuaded from taking care of her kid, and it's a difficult kid to take care of, like an infant male might be, she won't do it. So you've got more neglects. So what does the grandmother do and the father do? I'm going to get to the father in a minute, but we want to work with the nonverbals, but rather the voice, the body, the movement, some of the ways that we're learning that are nonverbal ways of working with trauma. And this little child who doesn't have nearly the prefrontal development to work with language will be responsive on that level. Now, interestingly, and then I'll stop because I know I'm going on a long time, but what Alan Shore teaches us, which I didn't know until recently, is that in the first 2 years, which is the first 24 months. And there's so much to say about this. I'm really working on my material for this. I'll have a lot more to say later. And if you can't go to Oxford, you can certainly attend on Zoom because it's going to be a great conference. But what we learned from Alan Shore, and I don't know why this research isn't more out in the world, but the first 2 years of life, the main source of regulation, and we'll be talking about regulation much more in the course, but the first 2 years of life, the mother is the main source of regulation. And basically, she's regulating the fear system. The second, after a child is between 2 and 3.5, which is the age that you're asking about, the father becomes more primary. And the father or the parent who's more likely to engage in rough and tumble play, which may or may not be the sort of gender identified male parent, but the more rough and tumble parent is helping that child to regulate their aggression and their anger. So at at the age of your toddler, you probably need rough and tumble play, which is where the child learns more about movement and, aggression and taking turns and competition and fun and some of those kinds of activities. The father or the more oriented in that direction of rough and tumble play, that child, that 32-month-old child, needs that as well. So this is a very long answer to a very interesting question. Certainly, none of it is simple. So I'll leave it there for now. I'm sorry I went on so long.
No, that was great. There was a lot of great information there. I'm sure they'll be able to have some great takeaways from that. All right, we have another question here. Could you talk about masturbation before and after marriage, please? How
Oh,
does
sure.
this benefit or harm the relationship and oneself?
That is a great question. Well, first of all, there are whole systems of thought and morality and religion that have belief systems about masturbation. So we need to make sure we have a shared value system. Now, it's important to be able to talk in the couple about masturbation because I have certainly heard, kind of to my chagrin, that some spouses think of masturbation as a kind of cheating. It's like you're wasting your libido, or wasting, or you're sort of using your libido without me. So they either feel left out, or they feel jealous, or they feel confused what it's about. And so, if they think of masturbation as cheating, and similarly, if it's accompanied by some kind of visual stimulation, often referred to as porn, which I don't like using that word because it's really value laden, and the definition of what constitutes porn versus erotica and what kind of, visual stimulation is damaging and exploitative and what is not, that is a whole chapter in itself. So I avoid that word. But if there's a use of some kind of visual in addition, sort of alongside the masturbation, that may be something that the couple needs to talk about or the partner has feelings about it. All that being said, if we've got a desire discrepancy, meaning if one partner would very happily have sex once or twice or three times a day, and the other partner's rhythm of desire and natural availability based on their own libido is maybe more like once a week or once every 2 weeks, masturbation can be a very adaptive addition because that way there the desirous partner doesn't walk around with this discomfort of, unfulfilled desire in their body, which can make them feel irritable or can awaken that old rejection wound or that own revulsion wound if they have that. So it can be very adaptive. Some couples where there is this discrepancy between them, which is normal. I, in fact, think it's in the service of preservation of the species that we have discrepancies of desire, because God forbid if we only had high desire people, or if we only had low desire people pairing up with each other, we'd probably lose a whole lot of, the gene pool because they wouldn't be reproducing. So it may be a way of really sort of evening out the discrepancy. Some couples find it to be greatly a turn on to masturbate in each other's presence, or for one to masturbate the other, because they might not have the libido level that would make them able to masturbate right then, but they might be available to stimulate the other, which then makes it a shared experience. So, first of all, to sort of sum up, we need to have shared values. We need to find out what it means to each of them and what is the impact of masturbation on this partnership. And if there is the sort of on the side issue of visual stimulation, we need to have a values clarification conversation about that. So it's a great question, and it's something very worthy of discussion in our sex therapy with the couple. Long drawn out answer. This is why you need to come to the course, because this quickie, I can't do it all in, such a short time. So go on.
Oh, you're doing a great job, Ruth. I have a question here. Someone wants to know when your next book will be published.
Oh, great question. Well, first of all, I'm working on a workbook for therapists. And partly it's because I've gotten so many requests for training, and we're working on preparing these courses, as you know, Laura. So, and it takes time to prepare a course, especially when I have an ongoing client load. So I'm up to here, and sidebar, I'm a devoted home cheesemaker, and I'm having a terrible Jones because I haven't made cheese in 2 months because I've been too busy making courses and writing and seeing clients, and that's terrible for my nervous system. So back to your question, I got a lot of requests for training, and while we're working on the trainings, which take longer to produce, similarly, I'm working on a workbook so that people in their supervision groups, and with their partners and on their own can advance themselves in neglect-informed psychotherapy. So I'm working on the workbook. Our goal is to have the workbook come out, and the turnaround for publication is about a year. So we're aiming to finish I'm aiming to finish the manuscript, which my with my editor Angel, to have it done by the end of August, so I can go into I can submit the completed manuscript in time to come out in September of 2026. That's the goal, and I've got a lot to do. And so that is the next book in the pipeline. And then the other one that's in the pipeline, which is behind that one, which has had to wait because I'm doing the workbook first, is a lay people's book, no pun intended, about neglect. And it's going to be called Too Much of Nothing, which is a great song by that Bob Dylan wrote way back in the 60s. And one thing I recommend you all do is go on YouTube and look for the 1967 video of Peter, Paul, and Mary singing Too Much of Nothing. It's about 3 minutes. It's our theme song of neglect-informed psychotherapy. So the lay people's book, the trade book, as they call it, is it's next in the pipeline. So when I finish the workbook, that's the next piece of work, but I've got all these trainings to complete. So I'm doing my best to get it done. But thanks for coming to this training, because that way there we can advance the information. And it's so important to me. And I use the word neglect informed because it's taken so many years since the diagnosis of PTSD was named in 1980 to actually neglect inform the world, not only the mental health field, but the medical health field, the journalism field, and the mass public, to neglect inform the world. I mean, to trauma inform the world. So now so much of the world is trauma informed. It's sort of part of our DNA. I want to do that with neglect as well. So to neglect inform the world with your help, because nothing is not nothing. That is my slogan. Nothing is not nothing. Nothing is something and nothing matters. That's my rallying cry. So please join me. Next question.
I love that. Okay, we had sort of a follow-up to the first question you answered. This person says, please address the extended family, grandmother role in child rearing. Let's not go to blame and negativity, but embellish the loving role of several caretakers and the legitimate deep attachment toward a unified, loving presence that exists in many parts of the world, like in African, Indian, South American cultures. They feel this presentation is currently addressing a nuclear family structure.
Thank you. That is a great question. And if you I have a YouTube channel, and one of the things that is next in the pipeline for a YouTube is I'm going to be really having an in-depth conversation with a non-binary person who is helping me sort of unpack the whole category of nuclear family configurations, because many queer people and non-binary people experience this tragic rejection by their families of origin that boil down to family loss. So we're experiencing, even in the Western world, more new family configurations, and to broaden our view of what constitutes family. And your person who answered the question is very, very right, that I've presented a very nuclear family oriented view. And these cultures where we have a whole village working together to raise the child is ideal. So you're absolutely right. And what Alan Shore reassures us is whoever is most available and present, particularly if there's consistency around it in those first moments and months of attachment and development, whoever that person is becomes the primary attachment figure. So if you have a queer couple who the person who is primary caretaker is not the one who gave birth to this child, but is the one who's in that primary role, that person becomes the one that that infant then makes that primary attachment to. It's preferable if we have consistency around that person, at least at the beginning, but to have a village of people so that child is not that bereft, lonely child that's floating in space in a world of nothing, is that's devastating. And that's where the child just sort of has this dissociative, lost, untethered, despairing feeling of nothing matters, and there is nothing. So having these extended families is exquisitely important and helpful. And some of the Western cultures are way ahead of us. And similarly, some of the devastation that we are wreaking in the non-Western world, where the parents and the mother who is carrying the infant is so stressed and pumping cortisol, stress hormones, into that fetus, that's deadly. So we need to really change that, which is why, as Bessel so accurately said in the conference I was just at, we cannot treat trauma and neglect without dealing with the big picture, the big political picture. And right now, this world it's in sorry shape. We've got a lot to do. So that was sort of a roundabout answer to that question, but thank you for the question. And I'm working at really updating my model so I have more information that is of use. Do keep an eye on our YouTube. I'm going to have the guest speaker named Mariah Rooney, who is going to talk to us about non-binary family configurations, and that will somewhat address this question. But we are working at broadening the information base and sort of widening the view of neglect information. Thank you for that question.
Excellent. Thanks, Ruth. I found one question here that kind of addresses something I've heard you talk about before, so I thought I'd bring this up. Could the neglect factor rather be a missing link in sexual trauma? I'm thinking of Judith Herman's book, Father-Daughter Incest, and how usually there is a cold mother before there is an abusing father, where the attention from the father seems like a life-saving option.
Great question. And we will be talking about this more in the course. But the key word is regulation. And regulation, I don't have time to really unpack regulation right now. But regulation has two meanings. I'm not going to go into detail, but basically the nervous system of the infant who is neglected will be either hyper or hypo aroused. And when we learn about trauma, we sort of learn that there's a window of tolerance, and that when we get activated, when we get triggered, the arousal goes really high. And when we are alone, like the child of neglect, the arousal, the stimulation level may be really low. And one of the important functions of the primary caregiver is to help the child learn to manage the natural ups and downs of regulation, because sort of by nature, when we're hungry or scared or cold or wet, whatever the need might be, we get, upset and activated. And a good caregiver helps the child to calm down and understand the ups and downs of the nervous system as natural and as something we can both be have help to manage and then learn to manage ourselves. And if that doesn't happen, and we have a dysregulated nervous system where the person cannot calm down when they get hyperaroused and cannot, get going again when they drop into that sort of dead, dissociated nothingness. They don't have that capacity for self-regulation. Well, sexuality, we're going to go into this more in the course. Sexuality requires a delicate balance between stimulation and calm. Because if we don't get excited, we can't, we're not turned on. And if we are scared or unsafe, we can't function sexually. So, what does that mean? It means we have to have a balance in the nervous system between sympathetic arousal, the arousal side of the autonomic nervous system, and parasympathetic, which is calming, the safety side of the autonomic nervous system. We need to have both. And if this child or adult no longer has regulation, their sexuality, or if they never were regulated and so they can't manage their activation, their sexuality is either going to be like a runaway train or a dead person. So it can show up all kinds of ways, even if there's not sexual trauma, overt sexual trauma, meaning hands-on or body parts on sexual trauma. We're going to talk more in the course about different kinds of sexual trauma and also the ways that non-overtly sexual trauma can disrupt sexuality. So that's a big topic. It's a good one. And you add to that where the child then finds that they do get attention from the parent who's using them, or the non-parent, the person who's touching them and, turning them on, or maybe making them feel good, or maybe not making them feel good, by the attention, it's really confusing for that kid. And so they will have so many mixed messages and so much shame. And I thank you for bringing up the subject of blame, because my whole model of every kind of work is the no blame paradigm. Blame is not our paradigm. And what you'll find with abusers and people who neglect is we've got generations of it going through the gene pool and through history, which is why we have to change this world. Long answer, much more needs to be said.
Okay. Well, they're long answers for a good reason. Thank you for that, Ruth. Okay, I have another question here for you. What is your take on people who identify as aromantic and those who identify as asexual? Do you address these identities only insofar as the client may not be thriving within those designations?
That is a really good question. And I know that people have come to name asexuality as another orientation. And it's a good question. It's certainly conceivable. I don't have data on whether or not it is a biological, you know, experience in some people's bodies where they simply lack that arousal curve on any level. And I do know that some people take comfort in that designation, because if they have no libido, and if they have a what they experience as no libido, and they feel shame about it, it gives them an identity that has some kind of normal associated with it. So I'm not going to argue about it. If somebody identifies as asexual, I leave it alone. I don't want to argue about it. And the truth is, I don't know enough to really speak to that, but it's a really interesting question. I don't know if there's data or research about it. And, as usual, I'm not a researcher. So if there are researchers among us or among you, I welcome whatever you might know about research that is out there, or research that you might take on, because I'm not a researcher, and research adds so much credibility, so much evidence basis to everything that we're trying to do. So it's an excellent question.
Thanks, Ruth. I think we will take one more question here. I had one. Oh, there we go. So many adults are now calling themselves or diagnosing themselves with ADHD. Do you see a relationship between the regulation and the issues that you describe?
Absolutely. And I have so much to say on this subject, because the infant who is left alone and has an understimulated brain, one of the things that's counterintuitive that I learned in my neurofeedback training is that an ADD or an ADHD brain is under firing, which means that that brain is firing too slow. It's under firing, meaning it has a low speed of, brain wave activation. And so in neurofeedback, what we do with the ADD and ADHD brain is we get the brain to fire faster or fire higher, which is why people are prescribed amphetamine drugs, which makes me really worry about a whole generation of kids growing up on amphetamine drugs. But it's there to speed up the firing of the brain so that that brain has focus, so they can attend, so they can be present. So there is definitely a correlation between the understimulated infant brain and ADD, ADHD. It's not the only cause, but it's certainly one that I don't rule out. And I think there's, and this is a bias of mine, Bessel always says diagnosis is a political construction. And in certainly in the US, we've got this medical industrial complex, which involves big pharma. And so I have no idea how much money is being made on the amphetamine drugs that are being, you know, dosed like crazy to children. And so often, and this is what I call the diagnosis du jour, where kids are slapped with an ADD or ADHD diagnosis and slapped with a prescription for amphetamine drugs, which then really makes their lives difficult because they have sleep problems or they feel uncomfortable on the medicine or some combination thereof, or even shame or just difficulty staying on track with the meds. So I do think that addressing neglect is a way to at least put a dent on this epidemic or this overdiagnosis, from my point of view, of ADD and ADHD. And there's not enough, I don't have enough data or enough information, but I know that I've certainly heard both from different neuroscience attachment researchers. Alan Shore and Ruth Lanius both speak to this, and they say both things that we have a biologically based ADD, and then we have an experientially neglect related based ADD that both exist. So I need more information to be able to really answer that definitively. But thanks for the question.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ruth, for your presentation and for answering everybody's questions so thoroughly today.
Well, thank you, Laura, and thank you, Bridget, even though we can't see you. And what I do want to say to our audience is, please get on our mailing list. We've got free blogs and free videos that come out to your inbox every week. And also join us for the course where we'll really get to go into this material in more depth. Thank you for your attention. Please remember, nothing matters. Nothing is not nothing, and it matters. It is
Yes.
something. Thank you. Bye for now.
You can click the link in the chat if you want to learn more about the course, and we hope we'll see you there. Take care, everybody.